Hi there, welcome to this tutorial on Java EE web application from in 2018. In this tutorial, we'll learn to develop your first Java web application. We'll learn about servlets, JSPs, JSTL, and a lot of other stuff. What will we learn during this tutorial? In this tutorial, we will learn the basics of how a web application works. Any web application works based on HTTP request and HTTP response. We will understand them first up. Then we would understand the basics of a Java web application. We'll understand what a servlet is, what a JSP is, what JSTL, EL, and things like what a JDBC is. After that, we'll look at the typical architecture of a Java web application. Even though we would learn about JSP servlets in this tutorial, there are other frameworks like Spring MVC, Struts, Hibernate. These are the frameworks which are typically used across the Java web application world. In the third part, we will look at what are the typical frameworks which are used in Java applications today. In later parts of the tutorial, we'll learn a lot about advanced servlets, advanced JSPs, and we'll develop a real-world Java web application. What is the approach we would use during this tutorial? First thing, all our tutorials are hands-on. We have a lot of source code examples which are available. You can download them from our website. The installation guide will help you to set up Maven, set up Eclipse. We use all the latest annotations in Java EE 6. And we would run a real-world Java application in Tomcat and learn about it. Let's start off looking at the application we would want to develop. What we are looking at is the application we would want to develop during this. You can enter the user ID, password, sign in. This is a login form. You get into the website. You can edit a to-do. You can update it. You can create a new to-do if you want to. And you can delete them as well. You'd see a little bit of information about the to-dos in here. You can create a new to-do, you can edit them, delete them. This is kind of a typical Java web application, and this has the logout functionality as well. This is the application we would want to develop by the end of this tutorial. We will start with understanding the basics of a Java web application. We'll start with understanding the basics of any web application. We'll understand what a HTTP request is and what a HTTP response is. And we'll also understand the basic request flow in a Java web application. We'll understand what a servlet is, what a JSP is, and how to run the web application in Tomcat. Let's start with understanding the basic flow. What you're seeing on the screen right now is a typical request flow in a Java web application. The user goes to a browser. He wants to go to a website. Let's say he wants to go to a website, google.com. Once he types in google.com on the browser, what the browser does is it creates something called a HTTP request. The HTTP request consists of the details of whatever action user has performed. The HTTP request is sent to the Google web server. What the Google web server does is internally it would process the request. So it will process the request and it will generate a response which is called a HTTP response. And the HTTP response is returned back to the browser. That's basically typical flow in case of any web application. The browser creates a HTTP request, sends it to the web server. The web server processes the HTTP request. For a Java application, the way it processes it might be different from a .NET application. But the concept of the HTTP request and HTTP response is the same for any web application. So the browser sends a HTTP request to the web server. Web server processes the request and sends the HTTP response back to the browser. The browser would then see what the HTTP response is and it would show it on the screen. What you're seeing on the screen right now is a typical web application. You have an email form and a password. What I did first was I typed in localhost 8080 and pressed enter. Once you do that, you can do a right click on the Firefox browser and say inspect element. What we want to see is what is happening in the background of this request. So we get into something called developer tools. The developer tools is available at right click, inspect element. Once you do that, it opens up this particular set of tabs. We will discuss about what is the different information which is present in here later. But for now, we are interested in the network tab. I would go to the network tab. If I go to the network tab and do a right click, reload of the current page, you can also do that by pressing F5. You'd see that there was a GET request which was sent to the web server. So the GET request was sent. What was the URL? Localhost 8080. That's what we typed in the browser. And this created a get request. And what is the response to the get request? I'll click the response tab. The response is exactly as you see on the screen. You see that there is an email, a password field, and a submit button. You see those on the screen right now. So basically, the get request was sent, and there was a response which was sent back from the server, which contains the HTML to show on the screen. So basically, the way this flow worked was the browser when I typed in localhost 8080, the browser created a get request, and the get request was sent to the server. The server responded back with this particular response. This response was sent back to the browser, and the browser looks at this HTML. The browser knows how to display this HTML on the screen, and it shows the HTML on the screen. So this is a typical request response flow for any web application, whether it's a Java web application, a .NET web application, or any other web application. This request flow remains the same. What we were looking at until now was the communication between the browser and the web server. The browser sent HTTP request, and the web server sent back a HTTP response. In the background of a Java web application, there is something called a servlet and a view. The web server gets the HTTP request. What it does is it converts it into HTTP servlet request. This HTTP servlet request is Java specific. The web server converts it into HTTP servlet request and gives it to the servlet. The servlet would do all the processing around the HTTP servlet request, and it would generate a HTTP servlet response. And the HTTP servlet response is sent back to the browser. The new terminology which we introduce right now is HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. A Java web application will not know directly about the HTTP request and the HTTP response. For a Java web application, all that it would know about is a HTTP servlet request and a HTTP servlet response. If I want to take something from the request, then I would read from the HTTP servlet request. If I want to show something on the screen, I would send it as part of the HTTP servlet response. Process the HTTP servlet request and generate a HTTP servlet response. We use something called a servlet and a JSP. JSP is also called a view. So view is showing the information on the JSP is a view. There are other view technologies as well. We'll talk about them a little later. So for now, the important things we have learned is a browser creates a HTTP request, sends it to the web server, and the web server would convert it into HTTP servlet request, and it would be processed by the servlet and the JSP, and they would generate a HTTP servlet response in combination, and the HTTP servlet response is converted to HTTP response, and the HTTP response is sent back to the browser. The browser looks at the HTML which is sent back to it, and it would show it on the screen. That's a typical flow. What we'll do now is we'll create our first Java web application. What we'll do is we'll create one servlet. Let's call it the first servlet. And also we would create one simple screen. We'll call it the first.jsp. So what we want to do is to create a very simple servlet, first servlet. What we'll also create is a very simple JSP. As we indicated earlier, we are going to use an IDE called Eclipse and a build tool called Maven. Eclipse is really a beautiful IDE, and Maven makes running web applications very, very easy. It makes managing dependencies a walk in the park. 90% of the real world projects use Maven. So if you don't know Maven, I would recommend you to look up the tutorial Maven in 28 minutes and get an overview on Maven. The installation guide, the link to which you can find below the video, will help you get set up with everything here. The link to the sample source code is also present below this video. Download the sample source code and unzip it and import that particular project into Eclipse. I'll import, it's a Maven project, so I'll select existing Maven project. So you need to type in Maven typically. Once you type in Maven, in the options, select existing Maven project, click next, and it asks you a directory. Select the directory where you extracted this zip. So usually you need to select the directory which contains the form.exe. I've extracted it to this folder. I'll click finish. We'll look at the structure of the project right. There's a file called pom.xml. The pom.xml is the most important file for Maven. The pom.xml, you specify what are the dependencies. Let's say I'm using Spring MVC frameworks or Hibernate. You would specify that in pom.xml. And Maven has this beautiful setup where once I say in pom.xml, I'm using version 1.2 of Spring, Maven will go and get it to me and make it available for me. So you don't need to manually download the Spring jar, download the Hibernate jar, download other jars and make them available in the build path. You don't need to do that. Maven takes care of it. And that's why Maven is really good thing to learn. The next important file inside our project is something called a web.xml. I'm using a Eclipse shortcut key, Ctrl+Shift+R. You can also do that by doing file open resource and typing in web.xml. You can see that the path to web.xml is shown here. So if I click through here, inside source, in main, in web app, in web.inf, that's where this web.xml file is. The easiest way to bring it up in Eclipse is pressing Ctrl, Shift and R all together. So press Ctrl, Shift, R all together and type in web.xml. And the web.xml is the first file a Java web application looks into when handling a request. In the earlier days, the web.xmls were huge. But now, the web.xmls are very simple because we use a lot of annotations. We'll look at them a little later. We are ready to create our first servlet. So let's create our first servlet. I'm going to do a right click. On source main Java, I'm going to do a right click, new class, and I would say I want to create my first servlet. I would give the package name as something. I'm giving com.in 28 minutes something. That's okay. Type in the name of the class as first servlet. Click finish. The first servlet is generated for you. The first thing I would want to make is any servlet should extend a particular class. HTTP servlet. I'm going to import the HTTP servlet. So now that's the first step done. What we did is we created first servlet, extended HTTP servlet. If I want to reach the first servlet, I need to give it a URL. How do I do that? Is through an annotation. The annotation is at web and press Ctrl space. It shows all the annotations which are available. The annotation we want to use right now is web servlet. And I put an open bracket and again press Ctrl space to see what are the options available. And I want to use the option URL patterns. And the URL pattern which I want to give to this particular servlet is /first. We have our first servlet. It's extending HTTP servlet and I have a URL pattern assigned to it, which is /first. Let's now run this application in Tomcat. So we would want to run the application in Tomcat. First thing, I go to terminal. If you are in Windows, go to command prompt. Once you go to the command prompt, cd to the folder which contains the project we are working on. You downloaded a zip and the zip you have unzipped it and put it to a folder. So cd to that particular folder. So I'm right now inside that particular folder. Once you are in that folder, you can type in a command mvn clean install. This is a Maven command to install the application. Don't worry about what it does if you don't know Maven. I would really recommend you to look out for the tutorial Maven in 28 minutes and understand what Maven is. But let's go ahead, mvn clean install. The next command we'll run is mvn tomcat 7 run. mvn tomcat 7 colon run. It's mvn space tomcat 7 space, sorry, not space, tomcat 7 colon run. And press enter. Now, the web application is being run. So, where is it being run? I can see the URL here. So, I'll take the URL, Control C. I'll go to the browser. The URL is localhost :88, but the URL to the servlet is /first. So I'll take this also. Localhost 8080/first. That's the URL to this particular servlet, because I told the URL to this is /first and the server is running on localhost 8080. So this is the URL to this server. So let's press enter. Okay, that's very good. So the thing which is coming back is it's saying HTTP method get is not supported by this URL. So what has happened is we were able to go to this first servlet, but the error we are getting is saying HTTP servlet get is not supported. So the first thing we would want to understand here is there are two HTTP methods. One is get and the other one is post. When we type in a URL in the browser, when we type in a URL in the browser, let's say localhost 8080, I'm typing in this URL. What request we are sending in is get. When we type in a URL or when we click a link or something of that kind, we usually send a get request. The other kind of request is a post request. We will learn about the post request a little later. Let's focus on the get request for now. The error we got says get is not supported by this URL. How do we really make it support a get? The answer is by adding a method called doGet. So just type do and press Ctrl space bar. Eclipse suggests different options. So go and select doGet and double click. And it generates the dummy method for doGet. I don't like this arg0 and something like that. So I name this to request and response. And I'll remove this to do request and response. Save. So we have defined a doGet method inside the first servlet. We'll also remove the line super.doGet. So I've removed that particular line also. So we have created an empty doGet method. So all that we have now is an empty doGet method. Let's see what happens when I refresh the page. When I refresh the page, I get an empty response back. That's really good, because that means we are going to the first servlet, and because this is not returning any response back, we get an empty response. That's really great. You've just created your first servlet. Even though you are seeing nothing on the screen, there is something working. I'm not happy with the empty response. I would want to write something to the response. So how do I do that? That's response.get writer. So I want to write to the response, so I get the writer. And what do I want to write? I want to write in bold, birdie. This is working. What I'm doing now is I'm getting a response.get writer and calling the println method on it. And I'm sending some response back. So I'm saying, buddy, this is working. Let's see what happens. Wow. You see that on the screen. So, buddy, this is working. So when I type in the URL localhost :8080/first, buddy, this is working. That's great. Let's see if we can add more. I would want to say, I'll add a new line here, and I would want to say, buddy, this is great. There you go. You see that on the screen as well. There's a small problem with this, however. Unfortunately, the HTML content which we are putting in here, if we put a lot of HTML content in here, it becomes very, very unmaintainable. We should not put HTML content in here. We should put HTML content in something called a JSP. The fun part is actually a JSP is also another servlet. Let's not get there right now. Let's create a JSP which kinds of prints the same message. What we want to create is our first JSP now. The usual place to create JSPs is inside web.inf folder. So if you look at the directory structure right now, source, main, web app, web.inf. Inside that we created a folder called views, and we would create the JSP there. So we'll create a new file. I would want to call it first.jsp. What do I want to show in first.jsp? Exactly what we had typed. So I'll do a Control X and put it here. Control X and put it. Let's do it. Oops, everything disappears. This is because we are actually printing two empty strings. We created a first.jsp, but we didn't tell the servlet to send it to first.jsp. The first servlet should send the request to first.jsp or should redirect it to first.jsp. How do we do that? That's where a concept called request dispatcher comes into picture. So I'll remove these two lines of code and I would type in request.get request dispatcher. To the request dispatcher, we need to give the path to our JSP. So where is our JSP present? Our JSP is present in WebINF, views and first.jsp. Always the path starts from WebINF. I would need to put in WebINF /first.forward request response. So what we are doing now, the first servlet, as soon as it gets the request, it's forwarding it. To what is it forwarding it to? To the JSP. This is how you forward to a JSP. Let's see if it works. There you go. Buddy, this is working. This is great. I really want to be sure it's coming from the JSP. So I would go in and add one more line to the JSP. This is really good. Okay, that's perfect. It's working. I didn't do a bold, so it appears in the normal font and not really in bold, but that's fine. So we have our first servlet and the first JSP working. That's really great. So what we have is a doGet method, which is redirecting to the JSP, and the JSP shows the content which needs to be shown on the screen. Should we make it a little bit more complicated? We sure will. I want to now pass a value from the servlet and I would want to use it to display it on the JSP. How do I do that? The way you do that is by doing something called request.set attribute. You can put the attribute name in here and the value in here. So let's say the attribute is batsman name and the value I would want to put in is such. So I'm doing a request.set attribute batsman name, such. And I would want to show the value on the JSP. How do I do that? I would want to say this particular batsman name is a great guy. This one actually I would want to pick up from the attribute which I set it into the request. The way you do that, here I'm going to use something called an expression language. It's $ open brace and put the name of the attribute. So the name of the attribute which we put in is batsman name. So I'm using the same thing in here. $batsman name is a great guy. Let's see. You can see that. So Sachin is a great guy. Now I can go to the database and get this value. So this, instead of hard coding Sachin in here, I can probably talk to Cricinfo and get the information and set the attribute in here, and the first.jsp would show that information. So you are able to get some dynamic information from the servlet and you are able to put it and show it on the screen. That's really great. This is how you put something in a request and show it on the screen. That's your first introduction to servlets and JSP. So what we looked at is your first servlet and your first JSP. Inside the JSP, we use something called an EL, expression language. What we learned until now is basic servlet, basic JSP and basic EL. We will learn a lot more about this later in this tutorial. Now that we understood what a servlet is, what a JSP is and what EL is, not a lot but a little at least, we will look at what is the typical architecture of a web application. We looked at servlets and JSPs. The servlets and the JSPs are typically considered to be part of the web layer of a Java web application. The web layer is where all the view related things will be. So JSP is the view. Servlet is also related to generating the view. So servlets and JSPs are the most simple view technologies. In the web layer, usually we use a concept called MVC, Modal View Controller. We'll look at it a little later. The most famous MVC frameworks are Spring MVC and Struts. Nowadays, Angular is also getting popular, and Angular applications connected to REST web services is also a popular architecture. In the web layer, any of these things can be used. Once you complete this tutorial, we would recommend that you look up the tutorial Spring MVC in 28 minutes, Struts in 28 minutes, and Angular and web services tutorials as well. Spring MVC Struts are MVC frameworks. JSP, JSTL, EL, these are view related technologies. Alternatives to JSP are FreeMarker and Velocity. JSF is a little different thing. Let's ignore it for now. Real world Java application, a web layer will not return data on its own. What it will do is it will talk to a business layer. So the web layer calls a method in the business layer to get the data. The business layer would invoke the data layer. The data layer is the place where your database connection is. So the data layer talks to the database, gets the information and gives it to the business layer. The business layer does some business logic over it and gives it to the web layer. The web layer would then give it to the view to show it on the screen. That's how any Java EE application would typically work. Any real world Java web application would work. In the business layer, we use Spring framework to take care of things like transaction management, logging, and things like that. The data layer, we use JDBC is the most simplest one, is used in the data layer. There are things like Spring Data, IBATIS, and JPA. JPA stands for Java Persistence API. Hibernate is an implementation of JPA. Typically in the data layer these days, we use Hibernate. Very few projects use direct JPA. In summary, any real-world Java application would contain a minimum of 3 layers. Web layer, where your MVC framework and the view is. The business layer, where typically the framework which is used is Spring. Very few people use EJBs these days. And in the data layer, typically the framework which is used usually is Hibernate. JDBC is very rarely used. There you go. That's an introduction to a modern web architecture. Since this is really your first web application, I don't think we can get into a lot of details about the application. But I thought it would be really useful for you to know at a high level what are the different things which are involved and where do they fit in. Now that we created our first request, I would really want to go ahead and create our first form. What is a form? In a web application, you enter data and submit it to the server. The thing which is used to capture your data is called a form. Let's create a simple login form, capturing a user ID and a password. To create the login form, let's create a new servlet called login servlet. So I'll go ahead and create a new class, login servlet. Click finish. We know this already. We should extend HTTP base HTTP servlet, and we would need to give it a URL. So I use web space servlet and space again URL patterns. URL pattern which I would want to use here is login. When it's localhost/login, I want to go to this URL. And we know that to handle this, we need to have the to get. I'll remove these two things and let's write something to the response. So the way we would do that is response.get writer and tell him what we want to print. Let's see. This is what I would want to go to the not to the first. I would want to go to the login page. Okay, that's great. Dummy. That's perfect. So now I know that the servlet, when I type in the URL, I go to the servlet. So that's good. So now first thing I would do is I would want to redirect to a JSP. How do we do that? How do we redirect to a JSP? Is by saying request.get request dispatcher and type in the path to the JSP. webinf/use/login.jsp We didn't create the login.jsp, we create that. Dot forward, want to use request and customers. So now we have forwarded it to the login.jsp. Let's refresh. Okay, that's good because it's now saying login.jsp is not forms because we have not created it. Let's go ahead and create the login.jsp. I'll copy first.jsp and name login.jsp. Open up login.jsp and I want to use different content. Let's just say login. Let's see what. That's great. So the content in the JSP is being shown. So the first login.jsp is coming up. But what we want to really create in here is a form. So we want to create a login form. For that, we would need to use a little bit of HTML. The first thing I want to create is a form. So I start with a form element. So form. For any form, I need to give it something called an action. Action is the URL which it redirects to. The URL I want to redirect to in this particular thing is login. So I'm saying form action is equal to login. Whenever we are submitting a form, we need to use a method called post. So I'll also add in a method post. We will discuss a little bit about post a little later. We created a form. And what we would now need to do is add elements to this form. So let's go ahead and add an element. How do you add an element? Is by putting input type is equal to text, name is equal to, I want to capture the email. Because we are using HTML5, we can even say type is equal to email. There's an email type also defined. I would also want to capture the password. So type is equal to password and name is also is equal to password. So email, I've added in a password and let's add in a submit button as well. Input type is equal to submit button. Just show it as or submit. Now let's see what happens when we see the page. Okay, so we see two fields and a submit button. Let's try and enter some information in here. So I would want to, what do I would want to show? I would want to say request user at in28minutes.com and I would want to enter password. You can see that when I say type is equal to password, it's hiding the values. And I would click submit. When I click the submit, I get a error saying HTTP method post is not supported by this URL. Can you think of what the reason is? The reason is because we have not defined the doPost method in the login servlet. The doGet method shows the page. The doPost method handles this submit. So when I click submit from this particular thing, it generates the post request. And here there is no doPost method. So let's go ahead and create the doPost. doPost. Let's first rename this. And let's for a start just say request response writer send just want to print success. I'm not doing anything, I just print success. And I would do a refresh. Typing password. That's great. So now the doPost method is called and success is shown. Right now we are not doing anything. Whatever values which are typed in, we are not even validating them. We'll do a simple validation a little later. Showing the page here itself will redirect to a JSP. What we'll do is we'll redirect to a success.jsp and create a new JSP, success.jsp. And I just want to show success. back to the first servlet. Check if it's fine. It's redirecting to the. Go back to the login servlet and see if it's redirecting to the success.js. Success in caps. That means it's going to the JSP. So that's really good. So we sent it to the JSP. But what we also want to do now is validate whatever is coming in. For now, let's hard code. So let's think the only right user ID and password that we want to allow is user at google.com, and I want the password to be password. What I want to do is, if it's user at google.com and password, I want to show the success page. If it's not, then I don't want to show the success page, but I would want to send the user back to the login page. Let's do that. So if the user enters anything other than this user ID and password, we want to send him to a login page again. So we'll say re-enter again. Your ID and password is wrong. If he enters the right ID and password, we would want to redirect him to the success page. Let's try to do that. We have some information entered on the screen. How do we get it in the request? That's the first question. The way we get it is by using request.get parameter. The request.get parameter. What parameter? Parameter is the name. So I want to get email. Let's say I want to get email. And then I want to get password. Request.get parameter password. What I'll do is I'll say string email is equal to request.get parameter. Okay? String password is equal to request.get parameter password. For now, I would want to see if the email and the password are coming properly. What I'll do is, how do I pass information between the servlet and the JSP is by setting something into the attribute. So I'll do a request.set attribute, email, and value I want to set is email. And next, I want to set password also. Check if password is also coming properly. And password. Now I will go and add these attributes to the success. What's the email which came in? $email. As soon as I set something into the request attributes, I can access them in the JSP by using $, open bracket, the variable name, close bracket. Similarly, we have the password also. So email and password. So let's see what's happening. I'll go back. I'm typing in user at in28minutes.com and typing in a test password. So you can see it right now. So success, the user ID I entered and the password I entered. That's really good. So we are able to get values which are entered on the screen. That is by using request.get parameter. Request.get parameter is used to get the values which are entered on the screen. And we set them as attributes and we are able to see that on the screen. So that's really great. But what we would want to do is check if it's a valid ID and password. So what I'll do is now, if email dot equals ignore case, what is the right email ID we thought of? User at google.com. And password dot equals ignore case. What's the password we thought of? Password. If this is true, then send it to success page. Else what we want to do? We want to send it to the login page again. What I'll do? Login page. Let's see if this is fine. Let's go back. User at in28minutes.com, test and submit. User at in28minutes.com and submit. It's coming back to the login page. It's working. And if I enter the right user ID and password, so I'll just copy and paste, be very sure. User at google.com, password. That's good. It's going to the success page. So when I entered the right ID and password, it's going to the success page, else it's going to the login page. But one problem that we saw is in the login page, I'm typing in a wrong password right now. It is showing the login page, but it's not showing the error message. Any clues on how to show the error message? The error message can be shown by setting a request attribute. So request.set attribute error, and error message is invalid ID password. I go to the login.jsp now. I go to the login.jsp now, and I would want to add in the error message. So how do I do that? Dollar. What's the name we gave? Error. Error. Let's see what it is. So it shows invalid ID and password. So let's log in. I would want to use user at 28minutes.com and some password. Click submit. It says invalid ID and password. And if I type user at google.com and password, click submit, it shows the success page. So we were able to use a simple form, and we were able to see the information which is present in there and validate it. So now we have created a simple login form and validated the user based on whatever values were entered on this.